ever met, and just such a wonderful thing to have us together in a room like this to talk about something so important as the rights of children with disabilities and the opportunity for us to take action and make sure that they can live and grow up in a family. My name is Eric Rosenthal. I'm the founder and director of Disability Rights International. And it's a pleasure today to celebrate International Day of Disability and to bring attention to the legislation that has been introduced in Congress by Senators Menendez and Moran, and there are 12 co-sponsors. The International Children with Disabilities Protection Act. I think it's both fitting and urgent that on International Day of Disabilities, we focus specifically on children with disabilities. It's a population that gets overlooked even within the disability community. But what we've learned is that when you invest in children, that it produces lifelong results, and that when we can get to children at a time that that they are still growing and developing, our interventions have that much more impact on their lives. And whatever we can do at those critical times in their life is just so tremendously, tremendously important. Science has shown that all children, regardless of whether they have a disability or not, need the love and care of a family. It is a universal, and unfortunately in the world that we live in, too many children are separated from their family because of disability. And it's really not because of any impairment that they may have, because we have found that whatever disability you may have, you can grow and thrive and benefit from living in a family. All children need to be in a family. All children have a right to be in a family. And what we have shown, and you're going to hear from many of the panelists, that there are great, wonderful success stories from the United States and around the world about how we can make that possible. And that's why this bill is so very important. It is a bill that really represents consensus values that I think we can all agree to. And so it is not surprising to me that it has gained bipartisan support. I want to read to you, just go through the list of the senators that have supported this bill, because it is from a broad range of political perspectives and really speaks to the consensus that we all feel about the importance of ensuring that all children can grow up in a family. In addition to Senators Menendez and Moran, Dick Durbin, Lisa Murkowski, Patrick Leahy, Marsha Blackburn, Jean Shaheen, Tom Tillis, Tim Kaine, Tammy Duckworth, Jeff Markley, Chris Murphy, Benjamin Cardin, Senator Robert Casey. So it is a truly bipartisan effort representing a real broad array of the political spectrum. And, you know, beyond what we know and we can say about the consensus idea that every child deserves a family, in my career with Disability Rights International, we've gone around the world. We've investigated, we've exposed what it means to happen when a child is separated from your family. And the horrors that I have seen about what goes on in institutions when children are separated from their families, the violence, the abuse, the trafficking, those are the things that you can visually see and that we have documented and exposed. What you can't see are the ways, the invisible ways in which it causes psychological damage and leads to developmental delays. So you can have a beautiful orphanage or institution where a lot of resources are put, but if a child does not have an opportunity to really bond with a family member, there will be damage. And that is what we've learned. We've also learned that the solutions to these problems, this is a problem that just doesn't need to exist, that with changes in law and policy, there are ways that we have shown in the United States that are core to our civil rights work, to our social policy, to our family values, that really reflect that all children can, in fact, be integrated into society and can have an opportunity to grow up with a family. Our panel today speaks to, and I think the people in this room speaks to, the fact that not only is this bipartisan, but it brings together communities that may not often talk to each other or work together as much as they could and should. The developmental disability community, the broad range of different disabilities, children's communities, family members, children's rights groups, international humanitarian relief groups, development organizations, faith-based organizations. We have more than 100 organizations that have endorsed this, a real diverse array of groups that have all rolled up their sleeves and come to work together, and we feel that that's reflected on our panel today. Let me just take a minute just to describe a little bit of what's in this bill, and then we're going to show you a short video. It's all a bit of an abstraction until you see what it's actually like in some of these institutions and hear the voices of the family members who are so desperately fighting to make sure that their children have a good life. The bill itself creates a fund program that would be implemented through the Department of State that would create a small grants program for family groups, for disability groups, for citizens working to bring about change in their own society. It's a tiny amount of money on the global scale, and the amount that we know that it actually takes to support people, to transform societies, we can tap into the enormous generosity. There's currently $2.4 billion a year in faith-based money alone going into supporting orphanages abroad. There's an enormous private stream of funding. Governments are spending funding, but when citizens in their own societies say, in our society, we want to make sure that no child is forced to go to an institution and that families have the opportunity to live together, to support those voices, to support the work of family members bringing about reform in their own societies. I can tell you from what I have seen, the tiniest resources, family members meeting somewhere in their living rooms without any support, and you give them a little bit of support, a little bit of training, it can have an enormous difference. So part of the money is the challenge of breaking up that $10 million a year that the money provides and making sure that it's given out in very small grants to the people who have the passion and caring to bring about change in their own society. And then part of it is to provide training and support for advocacy, for people who want to bring about reform in their own countries, for introducing policymakers. Many people have simply never seen a child with a disability growing up in a family. They have no idea that it's even possible. So the idea that we would create resources for training and support to build capacity around the world are built into this bill. A tiny investment in children, in advocacy, in training can have enormous, enormous impact. Let me just add some thanks before we show this video. This gathering would not have been possible. Isabel Hodge from the U.S. International Council of Disabilities, UCID, represents the disability leadership in the United States who's working on international affairs and has been so critical and has grassroots support in every state in the United States. And Isabel, your work on this has been wonderful, and UCID has been a fabulous partner. We developed this short video in collaboration with PLACE, the parents. I'm not sure I got the exact acronym.
I'll introduce myself.
Okay, when you introduce leadership, advocacy, and community empowerment, is that it? Did I get all the words right? So PLACE has been a supporter. I'd like to acknowledge my own board chair, John Heffernan, who's in the room, whose Foundation for Systemic Change has been a key partner. And the idea of systemic change, you know, you can provide a teddy bear here and a teddy bear there, but change is going to really happen when you get at the underlying systems. And that approach is so important. The TIDES Children's Policy and Funding Initiative has been critical in collaborating with us in this effort. And last but not least, Rita and Charles Bronfman and the Bronfman Prize have given me and DRI incredible support in making this possible. I just want to also mention before we show the video, Menendez staff, Marley Barlow and Charlotte Oldham Moore, who are standing in the back, have been absolutely incredible in their efforts on this. I've been beating at Charlotte's door for 20 years, and she finally couldn't get rid of me after a while, but she has put an enormous amount of time, both of them, into making this possible. It's been a real labor of love, and it's been a great collaboration, and we're deeply, deeply appreciative of that. Now, the video is very short. It's important to see. The sound system is rotten, and apparently there's no way for the sound to be fully broadcast through the sound system of the room. So we've got a little speaker up. Caitlin, my associate, is going to try to broadcast it from her laptop. There are subtitles, which we hope you can use, and we hope you can hear this video. Let's give it a try.
Disability Rights International is an international human rights organization with a focus solely on children and adults with disabilities around the world.
We go in and we look at the people who are in the most difficult circumstances. And that means usually people who are segregated from society, children who are put in orphanages, adults who are put in social care homes, where horrendous, horrendous abuses take place.
Segregated services for children and adults with disabilities is unfortunately a widespread practice in Ukraine. There are still thousands of kids in institutions in Ukraine now. These places are sad, lonely, and dangerous places for children.
As much as families would like to take care of their child disabilities and also to live with them, financial constraints force them to take them to orphanages. Children with disabilities, they are not orphans. They have their own families and they have a right to live with their families just like any other child.
Creo que hay muchas familias que necesitan mucha orientación y mucho apoyo económico, mucho apoyo moral. Espero que lo que ustedes hagan sirva también para que las autoridades de gobierno de cualquier país tomen conciencia de que hay un sector de la población que necesita este tipo de ayuda.
International aid needs to be directed to help people with disabilities and their families to fight for their own rights.
I strongly believe that for us to support children with disabilities, we need to support the families. Yes.
Disability Rights International has worked for 30 years to document the human rights abuses that take place in orphanages and institutions around the world. We have also learned that systemic change will only happen when people with disabilities and their families can advocate for their own rights. Children need the love, care, and support of a family, and there's no institutional substitute for that. The International Children with Disabilities Protection Act embodies all of these lessons and these hopes for children with disabilities and their families. The bill will create a small grants program to fund the work of parents and advocates working to bring about change in their own society, establishing funds for training and support. There are proven solutions to help families keep their children and make sure that any child, no matter what his or her needs, can live and grow up with the love and support of their family. We ask you to support the International Children with Disabilities Protection Act.
And hopefully we'll have a little time for questions and discussion at the end of the panel. But now let's turn to our amazing panelists today. Our first speaker, Isabel Hodge, who's the Executive Director of the U.S. International Council on Disabilities. She's a former Marine, Defense Department employee, mother of a man with a disability, and a fabulous activist. It's an honor to work with you. Isabel.
So I just want to get my tech right here. So I just want to thank Eric and wish everybody a happy International Day of Persons with Disabilities. It's actually December 3rd, but in our community it's such a huge event that we celebrate it, I think, for about 2 weeks, don't we? So The U.S. International Council on Disabilities stands with Senator Menendez and Senator Jerry Moran. I'm sorry, I'm from Scotland. I get nervous and my brogue comes out, so bear with me. And with Disability Rights International, partnering with them on this bill has been wonderful. It's really a life-changing experience to go to another country and see children with disabilities living in orphanages and institutions. No child should live in that environment. So we're a 30-year nonprofit. It's membership-based, and we have members, individual and organizational members, at the national and grassroots level across the United States, and our members support this bill. Over 100 organizations have endorsed this bill. That's highly irregular in many communities to get that level of support. So I really appreciate the time that Eric has dedicated to this, 20 years. That's incredible. And I appreciate the Senator Moran and Senator Menendez's support also. When we work as an organization with other countries and they're seeking to develop their own national disability laws, they often come to us and ask us, well, tell us about institutions in your country. And we get to say, well, we really don't have that many left. And how did you do that? Well, through the home and community-based waiver and important legislation that's been passed. People now can live in the community with the right supports. They're eager to learn about how cost-effective is, taking someone from an institution and having them supported in the community. And we're able to share all of the great documentation that's out there. The State of the States report, you're probably familiar with that, Diana. They're very eager to learn, how can this be cost effective? So we share that, but we're a very small organization. And there's no way we can touch all of these different countries that are seeking help to solve this problem. So this is why this particular legislation is important. We can obviously reach more countries, share more information. It's really going to make a difference. Guatemala comes to mind. I've spent a lot of time in Guatemala. And when I went through those institutions, I could pick out the kids and the young adults that should be living in the community with supports and would be very successful. That's just heartbreaking to see that they just don't have the opportunities. And I'll share something personal. So I have a son who is 31 years old, and he has autism and an intellectual disability. And Eric mentioned that I used to be a Marine. I was a Marine. And we met with a military pediatrician back in 1993 who said, your son should probably be institutionalized. He'll never read, he'll never write, he'll never be able to take care of himself. This is what you should do. Of course, we're not going to do that. We see, we even saw back then what institutions looked like because of, wonderful reports that DRI had done and other organizations. And we knew that our son, if in that situation, if he was in a facility, he would not survive. He was self-aggressive. He was, only 2 years old, and this, physician really destroyed what we thought our son's future would be like, but we decided differently. My husband and I started a parent support group for military families, and we led that for 5 years, and it was an amazing experience to work alongside other families, to work alongside school staff and military bases to create programs and services. So I know firsthand what it's like to have the training and support of the government and other organizations to lead a parent advocacy group. And I'm very happy to share that my son, this young man that was supposed to be institutionalized, lives in his own 1,600 square foot home. He has a personal care attendant through the Medicaid waiver. He is employed with the county. He loves to get his paycheck. He loves old Godzilla movies and Pokemon, and he's got a new puppy. He's driving us crazy, and he's looking for a girlfriend. So that I'm not sure I can help with, but I wanted you to see what's possible with the right supports and funding through a bill like this. When you support parents, when you educate governments, and you share the knowledge of what we've gone through in the U.S. and how the lives of people with disabilities can be vastly different and positive in the U.S. versus in other countries. So we can fix that.
Wrap up?
Yep. So I just want to thank Eric and, again, Senator Menendez and Moran for supporting this legislation. It's bipartisan. When does that happen? So we should celebrate that too. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Isabel. It's a beautiful story. It's one that I've heard in every country of the world that I've visited. And it's inspiring stories like that, getting those stories out that makes it possible to bring about change. And this is what it's all about. So Isabel, appreciate what you're doing. It's my great pleasure to next introduce the Honorable Judy Heumann, who's, I've known for 30 years and has been an inspiration to me and so many others in the disability community from the days when she was working on making sure 504 was implemented in the 1970s to today. She's been the Assistant Secretary of Education for Special Education and Rehabilitation Services, and she's the former State Department advisor on international disability rights. She's really been at the forefront of the international disability movement, and we appreciate her joining us today.
Well, I'm going to be 75 years old, and the reason I say this, one is when I started saying it was kind of like a shocker, but so I had polio in 1949. And I think one issue that's important to realize is most disabled people do not have their disabilities when they're children. And the reason I say this is really important is because the adult population pretty much has no understanding of the issues that families and children face. And so one of the reasons why I believe it's very important to put an emphasis both domestically and internationally with families who have children with disabilities is because families, as Isabel was saying, and as we'll hear from Diana, and like my family, they don't know other people who have kids with disabilities. They may learn about it a little bit more today. There is more going on. More kids are being integrated into school. There are more organizations. So people have a little bit of information. But Isabel just mentioned that when her son was 2 years old, the doctor suggested that he be placed in an institution. I learned when I was 36 years old that a doctor suggested when I was 2 years old that I be placed in an institution. So 2 is kind of a magical year, I guess. And clearly, Isabel's son and I were quite different. So I think one of the issues is the biases that still exist in the healthcare professions, even in the United States. And when we look at countries overseas where disabled children and adults are faring much more poorly in many countries, I don't want to put everybody in the same basket, you can see why it's really important that the U.S. that has been going through a transition now for many decades needs to be playing a leadership role in what the right policies, laws, and practices need to be. I also think that we need to recognize that we have officially and unofficially for many decades been exporting institutionalization. People from the U.S. who were working in institutions, who might have been retiring or wanted to go overseas and do work, were being brought in to talk about what was happening and what needed to happen. And in reality, many of those individuals had not worked on issues around deinstitutionalization, had not been looking at what alternatives needed to be created in the area of legislation, policies, and implementation and enforcement. But at the time that we saw more institutions developing in other countries, looking at the 1960s as an example, that's where we were really beginning to see some very critical court cases like Penthurst and Willowbrook and others that were moving forward. But that was not really being discussed at that time. So at the time when we were really looking at closing institutions, major litigation going on, federal and state governments beginning to put in place policies and practices that were putting money into what needed to happen, and like organizations like the ARC and UCP and others that were very substantially parent-driven, those groups also were not really doing work overseas with other families. It wasn't until the 1980s that the U.S. started to support and put funding into parent training information centers, and Diana will speak about that. But I think that was a very critical part of what was then the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act, was recognizing the importance of the voice of parents. So when we look at the legislation that's being proposed, I think we're looking at many things. Addressing the deficits that parents have not been given the support that they need in middle income and developing countries to understand the importance of coming together, because I think we have to recognize the fact that parents who have children with disabilities, who may be a little bit older, have experience that they can be talking about with parents who have younger children about what they did in order to keep their children at home, or what they're trying to do to get their children out of institutions, and also to be able to create a larger movement in communities. I think about groups like the Parent Training Information Centers, the technical assistance work that they're receiving, but then other programs like Partners in Policy, which started in the 1980s. And Partners in Policy, to me, is another example of the models that are out there, where parents were brought together for like a 10-month period of time, learning how to be advocates, learning how to address what learning about policy was, learning how to write statements that they could go and testify at the federal, state, and local level. But basically, parents coming together and becoming empowered. And I think that's really a very critical part of the progress that we've made in this country. And when you look at organizations overseas like Inclusion International, which is also focusing on parents and organizing parents, that's what we're talking about. I don't know how many of you have ever visited an institution. Could you raise your hands? Okay, how many of you are professionals in the DD area? Keep those hands up. And how many of you have visited institutions? How many of you have put another hand up if you visited institutions? Okay, so both. Now, how many of you who are not working in the field, you can put your hands down. How many of you who are not working in the field have ever visited an institution? Okay, not many. So I suggest that it's very important to visit some institutions. Now, thank God we don't have too many of them here, but we can also look at how we define institutions. And here we have, community living arrangements where there are more people that should be living in the same facility. But when I worked for the State Department, I visited an institution in Mexico City. I visited because it was a place that DRI had visited, and I brought people from the State Department to visit the institution. Those are very important sites. So any of you who are working with organizations or who are on a committee here, which is dealing with issues overseas, it's very important to make these issues more important.
And we'll help you get in if you need access.
Yeah, and we did, and it was pretty amazing. the smell of urine almost knocked us out of the car before we even parked. And it was not an unannounced visit, which really astonished me, quite frankly, to see that an announced visit would have the conditions that were going on in the institution. But what was very important was that people in the embassy had never visited an institution. And if you're a committee staff person, it makes sense to not only visit institutions, but also look at how children are growing up when they are in a family situation. And also to recognize that, as Isabel was saying, and as Diana will also discuss, the expectations are the low expectations of disabled children growing up and being able to work can be completely broken down when people are getting appropriate supports. People that were considered unable to work who are today working not only in the U.S., but in countries around the world because they, in fact, come on in, Senator. This is great. Senator Menendez. I had the privilege when I worked with him at the State Department on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We were unfortunately not successful, but never die, it might happen. So let me just conclude before he gives his remarks that it's very important that the senator has committed himself to this issue with his staff, recognizing, in part from what he's learned in New Jersey and around the country, what disabled people, particularly those with more significant disabilities, are able to do, and how our objective is keeping people out of institutions, supporting families so that they, in fact, can value all their children as they wish. Thank you.
I have the distinct honor of introducing Senator Menendez from New Jersey, who authored the International Children with Disabilities Protection Act with Senator Moran. Senator Menendez is chairman of the powerful Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he's long been a champion of disability rights. Thank you, Senator. Human rights and protecting the most vulnerable in societies around the world. Throughout his career, he's fought for disability rights both here at home and abroad, including especially in New Jersey and communities across the country. In 2012, Senator Menendez championed the Senate's effort to ratify the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and he has remained a fierce advocate for disability rights ever since. Last year, Senator Menendez received the Dole Harkin Award, the highest honor given by the U.S. International Council on Disabilities to a U.S. government official for distinction in public service to the global disability community. Senator Menendez, we thank you for your incredible efforts in behalf of the global disability community for being here with us today, and we look forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Ambassador, how are you? Good to see you. Thank you. Well, good afternoon. I'm thrilled to be with all of you. I'm sorry, a few minutes late. We just left a large delegation from Ukraine who is here to pursue prosecution of the Russian state for war crimes and for the crime of aggression. So they're very passionate, and they went on for a while. So we're a few minutes late, but we're thrilled to be with you. Let me first express my appreciation to Disability Rights International and USICD for putting this event together, and for everyone who's come down from New Jersey to join us. I appreciate my New Jersey constituents and advocates. They're tireless advocates, and I appreciate their participation as citizens in our society, actively engaged in promoting the rights of individuals with disabilities. The discussion of how we protect and support children with disabilities around the world could not come at a more important time. I remember where I was on this day, December 6, 10 years ago. I was here fighting for the ratification of a treaty so many of you worked on so well and so assiduously, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And it failed to pass the Senate by 5 votes. Even with a visit by Senator Bob Dole to the Senate floor, one of the last he ever made, we were not able to ratify the treaty. I thought at the time as the chairman, this is about as motherhood and apple pie as one can get. If we can't pass a treaty like this, I don't know what we can do. So that was a tragic moment. And as the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I believe the United States should have stepped up to provide leadership on the crucial question, because 10 years later, we can see the effects. As we sit here right now, there is an orphanage in Ukraine where children with mental and physical disabilities are starving. And although they are sheltering at an orphanage, they are not orphans. They still call out for their mothers and fathers in the middle of the night. Too often since the start of the war, children with disabilities have been left out of international relief and evacuation plans. Those of you who have worked on this issue for so long, you know these children, and you know the trauma that they suffer. You know their families were forced to make heart-wrenching choices. And you know that when conflicts erupt around the world, whether it's Syria or Cameroon or Ukraine, children with disabilities often suffer the most. But beyond these conflict zones, the situation is not much better. More than 1 billion people are living with some form of disability around the world today, and more than 240 million of them are children. Many of them are denied their most basic rights. Excluded by their communities, they face stigma and discrimination. Their families don't have the resources or support systems to protect and care for them. And so they are caught between not just a rock and a hard place. They send their children to live in residential institutions with absolutely abysmal conditions. Some of these institutions don't provide children with sufficient medical care. They neglect them. They subject them to sexual violence and abuse. They even shackle and restrain them. This has devastating effects on children, severely impeding their physical, mental, and emotional development. Everyone here knows that it's time for the United States to step up. We need to be doing more. We need to redouble our efforts as a leader on behalf of global disability rights. And that's why I authored the International Children with Disabilities Protection Act, which I am proud to introduce with Senator Moran on a bipartisan basis, and a strong bipartisan group of my colleagues earlier this year. This legislation will help parents so they can choose to keep their children with disabilities at home with their families. It will establish a grants program within the State Department, a program that can help empower organizations of persons with disabilities and family members of children with disabilities to advocate for reform. For too long, people with disabilities and their families haven't had enough support, even though we've seen over and over again that they are the best advocates for themselves and the disability rights movement. This law authorizes $10 million a year to support these advocacy efforts, as well as training and education for advocates and policymakers. The legislation will make it the policy of the United States to help countries protect and uphold the rights of people with disabilities. And that goes for everything from developing laws to implementing policies. These changes on the ground in countries around the world will give children with disabilities the chance to grow up as members of families and equal members of society. That's why I believe the legislation can be truly transformative. I'm heartened by the strong bipartisan support this legislation has received. I'm grateful to Senator Moran and all of our co-sponsors of this effort. It's been a long road to get to where we are, and we've got our work cut out for us to get this passed. But I know your dedication and your commitment to this cause, and that's why I'm sure in the end we will prevail and make this law a reality. So let's keep standing up for children with disabilities and their families all around the world. Let's recommit to fighting for basic human rights, even if there are countries who refuse to respect them. And to my colleagues who have not yet signed on to our cause, let's join together to make a more just and kinder world for everyone. This isn't a treaty. There isn't a reason not to support it. You must truly believe that there is a reason for global leadership on behalf of the United States of those who are most vulnerable in our society. And we call to the angels in the spirit of each and every one of our colleagues to join us in this effort. And with your help, I'm convinced we'll get there. Thank you very much for having me with you today.
Thank you very much, Senator Menendez. We appreciate your support. Having a true, staunch ally is invaluable. Our next speaker.
Moran's here.
Oh, Senator Moran has arrived. Okay. Who did you want to hear from? Okay. It's my great honor to introduce Senator Jerry Moran. Leading Republican, sponsor of the International Children with Disabilities Protection Act, Senator Moran has served Kansas in the United States Senate since 2011 and serves on the Senate Committee on Appropriations, including subcommittees on state and foreign operations, health and human services, and is co-chair of the Senate Down Syndrome Caucus. Senator Moran has worked to improve the quality of life for veterans in Kansas and across the nation as the lead Republican on the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. As a member of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, Senator Moran has helped shape health care policies, including those affecting children and people with disabilities. Senator Moran is dedicated to supporting and empowering individuals with disabilities and looks forward to continue this work in the 118th Congress. We welcome his support for this legislation to protect children with disabilities and their families around the world.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
While you were anticipating and perhaps hoping that someone else was going to speak, I'm pleased to be with you. And my remarks will be brief because a vote is occurring on the Senate floor. But I'm delighted to be here to indicate my support and efforts with Senator Menendez on an effort that is and should be something that is bipartisan. And we'll work to make certain that the two parties work together. Members from across the country in the United States Senate work to achieve a goal in which those with disabilities have a freer, more open life, not only in the United States but around the world. And delighted to be able to be the lead Republican sponsor. In part, there's a legacy to try to fill, shoes to try to fill. My predecessor in the United States Senate, Senator Dole, and his efforts in regard to the Americans with Disabilities Act and other great acts of kindness and legislative endeavor are something that are worthy of trying to replicate. And so I'm here to thank you for your support, your efforts, and we'll do everything we can to make sure that this bill becomes something we call a law. And we're delighted to join you in that effort. Thank you all very much for allowing me. Thank you.
A true pleasure to have the bipartisan support from Senator Menendez and Moran and the 12 other co-sponsors. Now, pardon the delay, Leo. I'm very pleased to introduce Leo Hosch, who's the Associate Vice President for Child Protection and Education at World Vision. As many of you know, I believe World Vision is the largest of the international development and humanitarian relief organizations, a faith-based organization that does tremendous work around the world and has really taken an important leadership role on disability. Having a spokesman like Leo is particularly important to us. He's also the father of a person with a disability. I remember on our preparatory call, someone asked him, what would your life and your child's life be like if you had not emigrated to the United States? And hearing kind of what you would have faced was just was heartrending. But we very much appreciate the good side of what's happened to you and your family and what you've been able to do in the world. Thank you, Leo.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Eric. And this is what I do. Why I do what I do right now, because knowing that what my child, the opportunity that my child had here, every child with disability deserves as well. So when my child was deeply buried in his autism, and by the age of 4, he could not speak a word, we made the tough decision to return to the U.S. To find support for his needs. Here in the U.S., he benefited tremendously from a lot of the social protection systems and supports that are available, including, as you might all know, IDEA 04, Autism Waiver, DOORS, SSI, DDA, and also the many other services that are available in the community. Many of these systems were passed by the Congress over the years, and we, tremendously value tremendously value the services and the support that they provided. Today, my child is 24 years old. He has an associate degree in biotechnology, and he works at the National Institute of Health. He has his car. He drives back and forth independently. Something that we never imagined. We thought it's nearly impossible to happen without all these support and services that are available here. Sorry. As I travel internationally, as a professional as well as a parent, I am deeply troubled by the status of children with disability I encounter. For I recognize that these children have the similar potential as my child, but they lack the voice, the policies, the service, and support for them to realize it. I'm therefore here today to support the programs incorporated in this bill and demonstrate in practice the incredible outcomes that small investments can generate when social protection policies are established. And when local capacity and support systems are strengthened in the community, outside residential care, and as caregivers and children with disabilities are empowered to fully participate and have a voice in decision-making. In Armenia, where more than 81% of children residing in state-run orphanages are children with disabilities, World Vision worked with local organizations and the government to institutionalize community social workers as a mandatory profession within the local governance and the welfare structure. This small investment led to 91 trained government and CSO social workers stationed in 86 communities supporting more than 10,500 households of children with disabilities. They support them with knowledge, training, and improved access to social services. In Colombia, World Vision's Social Accountability Citizen Voice and Action Program led to 2,700 persons with disability being engaged in 18 groups who advocated for changes that resulted in 175 improvements by the government, actions of improvements by the government and local service providers. In India, our Voice program led to over 23 assemblies of children with disabilities in 23 states, involving 6,500 children and youth with disabilities. These assemblies directly engaged with the government and with their communities, leading to changes in policies and critical improvements to services. Children and youth with disabilities were leaders in these assemblies, and they presented India in many forums, including at the United Nations General Assembly. Such activities yield transformative change and should be strongly supported. This bill will invest in advocating for children with disability worldwide to be nurtured with their families and communities, which is very critical, to be educated and skilled, supported to acquire decent jobs, escape the cycle of poverty, and become productive citizens and contributors to their communities as well as to the economy. So I thank you for supporting of this bill and moving it forward. Thank you.
Our final speaker before we get to break into our little reception in the back. Diana Otten, who is Executive Co-Director of SPAN, the Parent Advocacy Network of New Jersey, and Executive Director of the National Center for Parent Leadership Advocacy and Community Empowerment. I got it that time. The idea that parents have been able to take the initiative and take leadership in the United States, and that they have developed successful models that can be replicated abroad is just so important to the hope, the promise of this legislation, and the potential for impacting children with disabilities around the world. And so Diana can speak to those successful efforts and how we can begin to spread the kind of justice and humanitarian work that she's been able to do in New Jersey and around the United States. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you, Eric. I'm very, very happy to be here on behalf of National Place, which is an organization, you know, that long name is because of the word place, because we're all about the place of families and family-led, family-serving organizations at decision-making tables. And so that's about leadership and advocacy and empowerment. You know, 47 years ago, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was passed in the United States, and that changed the landscape for children with disabilities and their families. Over the last 47 years, we've seen a huge decrease in the number of children and even adults who have been institutionalized, and a huge increase in the inclusion of children with disabilities in their communities and in their schools. We're now at a place in our nation where the majority of children with disabilities are actually educated in the general education classroom, which is a wonderful accomplishment, and it only took 47 years. I just wanted to talk briefly about two models. Our members include different types of family-led, family-serving organizations, but they include parent centers and also family-to-family health information centers. And there's 91 parent centers and 59 family-to-family health information centers. And together, those organizations that around the country are providing information and training and support to families of children and youth with disabilities, and increasingly youth with disabilities themselves, to help them learn how to advocate for themselves, not just at the individual level, but also at the program level, also at the systems level. And many parent centers and family-to-family health information centers around the country serve immigrants of children with disabilities who, like you, decided they had to go someplace else because there was no support at all for their family who had a child with disabilities in their country of origin, and did not want to have to institutionalize their child and refused to do so. So we know firsthand how critical it is to provide training and information and support to parents. A modest investment can make a huge difference. Family-to-family health information centers get less than $100,000 a year to serve families. The smallest parent centers get $120,000 a year to serve families. And yet we're serving millions and millions of families and youth themselves. I think that one of the things that is critical to understand is that families really benefit, and children, from these modest investments. When you look at the evaluation that's done of the work of parent centers and family-to-family health information centers, over 90% of parents say that their needs were met by this family organization, that it helped them learn more about how to deal with their children's disability, and also that they felt ready to use the information. And that makes all the difference in the world, that sense of confidence of knowing your rights, knowing about your child's needs, and knowing how to advocate for them. Training parents to advocate for their children with disabilities has made not only a real difference in the lives of families in the US, but also parents all over the world have benefited from being exposed and learning from family organizations. I remember when Judy went to China and dragged me along with her, and we arrived at the airport after being, I don't know how many hours on planes, Judy, and we were supposed to go to the hotel, but instead Judy dragged us to meet with a group of parents. And we met with literally hundreds of parents in Beijing and Chengdu, and talked to them about what could happen for their children. I met a young man who worked at their Center for Independent Living, who said that the only reason he'd been able to go to school and then was able to graduate from college was because his father used to carry him to school and stay with him all day in school. Otherwise, he would have had to go to an institution. And here was a young man who was making a significant contribution to other people with disabilities. That experience, those parents meeting somebody from a parent center in the United States, led to 20 parents from China coming to New Jersey to learn about the supports that were available to families and professionals who were serving children with disabilities. And they were just energized and went back to China and renamed themselves Inclusion China, because they really were ready for their children with disabilities to be included. So I just think the most important example I wanted to give is that we've been doing some work in Tanzania with almost no money, literally almost no money, and we've been working with the Anglican Church and teaching pastors or people who are learning to be pastors for the Anglican Church to set up family support groups for parents of children with disabilities. And we've worked now, we have hundreds of parents in rural areas that are part of support groups. Parents are taking their children with disabilities out of hiding. Literally, people who lived in the same community did not know, who had a child with a disability, did not know that somebody else in their community had a child with a disability, because children were in hiding. And so just a small investment and the vision of what it could look like differently makes a huge difference in the lives of children with disabilities and their families in the United States and around the world. And in closing, I just want to say that the members of National Place, who are mostly staffed by parents of children with disabilities and special health care needs, are 100% behind this resolution, this law, and we'll do everything in our power to make sure that families of children with disabilities around the world have access to the same types of information, support, advocacy, and training that families in the United States have, so they can also stop institutionalizing their children and really dream of a positive life filled with potential for their children with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. That is so valuable to know and so many resources to share. We have a small amount of time for some question and answers. We got a reception in the back, so feel free to partake. I know Judy has to slip out. She warned me in advance that she had to leave a little early, so do what you need to do, but let's take this opportunity if there are any questions for our panelists, or anybody want to, yes. Yes. What barriers are in existence that will not allow inclusion or family?
The bill to pass. The bill to pass.
Oh, the bill to pass. Well, that's one above my pay grade. As far as I'm concerned, no logical person could possibly not support this bill. Getting a bill through Congress is a challenge. Getting both sides of the aisle, getting a vote. There have been no objections that we have heard on any substantive basis. And there's no opposition. So far, things are clear sailing. But honestly, as you all know, bipartisan legislation getting through Congress is a challenge. It's very important for everyone in this room who believes this is valuable to reach out to their congressman, to their senator. They need to know how important this is. I would say the major challenge is there are like 3 wars and global warming and lots of other priorities going on, and we just have to make clear that this is life or death for children with disabilities and families. Yes. Yeah. Yep. Okay. All right. Charlotte, who's Senator Menendez's staff. So we got to get this through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So particularly look up the members of the committee, make sure that they hear your voices. Karen? Yeah. I've known Karen for many years, and your work internationally has been incredible. She's been at the front lines and has worked with AID and many of these organizations. So you're so right that these issues need more attention, particularly in emergencies and conflict areas. Absolutely, you've done great work in this area, and we appreciate everything you've done, and that's absolutely a top priority. Yes, in the back. Those are two great questions. Judy, did you want to respond before you leave? Okay. Thank you. I will add that these issues are written into the language of the bill. For the subgrants, there is a requirement that the majority of the subgrants go to disability-led organizations, and disability-led organizations is defined to also include parent of children and youth with disabilities. So number one, there is a requirement that the disability community be the drivers of change and receive the money. And there is, and by virtue of that, by giving out subgrants, people will be making change in their own societies. So if anyone is well-placed to understand the cultural realities, the challenges, the barriers that exist in that society, that is the thinking behind this bill. By getting the money to the people who know what the barriers are at the national and the grassroots level, they're the ones who are qualified to bring about change. So it's not Americans telling them what to do, it's getting the money into those countries to the people who know what their challenges are. Certainly there will be training and support from the United States, but the idea is exactly to address those issues that you raised. That's why it's so important, and it is part of the structure of this bill.
And I just wanted to add one thing, which is that we heard two examples of people who were told by their doctors when their child was 2 years old or when they were 2 years old that they should be institutionalized. We have to get information to parents of children with disabilities around the world that that's not the only future that can be held. I can't tell you what it was like when I was talking to parents in China about my own experiences as a parent and what my children were able to do because of all the laws and protections and the training and information that was available in the United States. They were literally crying because for the first time they thought that there might be able to be a future for their children other than being in an institution. And so I think we need to make sure that we're not waiting until people with disabilities are adults and already institutionalized before we're trying to get them out of institutions, but we're actually telling parents there's something different, there's a different way to go. You don't have to do that you can advocate for your child and make sure that they can be in a loving family at home while they grow up to then be able to advocate in their own behalf, like the young man that I talked about in China who worked at the China's version of a Center for Independent Living, whose father and mother believed in him so strongly that his father literally carried him on his back to school every day so that he could go to school, because otherwise he would have been in an institution. And now he is advocating for other people with disabilities in China. So I think we have to make sure that we are balancing the funding for parent advocacy and training as well as for self-advocates.
Thank you. Thank you. In the front row?
Thank you. My name is Krista Giesecke, and I'm with the Global Campaign for Education US. Thank you for that example. I'm really glad to hear that that young man was able to access educational opportunities. But I'm wondering, our organization helps to convene the inclusive education and early childhood community of practice. What can we do to advocate together so that educational systems around the world are truly disability inclusive? And for all the children whose parents maybe have to work or who can't spend every single day taking their child to school, because that's ultimately an issue we're trying to work together to solve as well.
I think these issues are completely intertwined. Without accessible and appropriate education for all, keeping kids with families is going to be impossible. So these are common challenges that we all have to work on together. And it's just such a wonderful opportunity to get groups working on those children's issues together with the disability groups and coming up with common solutions. So I'm really hoping that, in addition, the kind of ripple effects of this bill are to bring about better collaboration between our groups. And we're really so glad you're here and look forward to working with you. Isabel or Leo, do you want to add to that?
I would just add that that's why the USAID and hopefully in the future the State Department's disability policy is we've got to push to get that revised and implemented, because we did a study a few years ago of USAID programs. Even though they did have a disability policy, I think the numbers were dismal for global health, like less than 5% or something of the programs that they were funding were disability inclusive. In the education sector, it was a lot better, and it's improved even since then. I think it was at 25%. So we really need to push to make sure that whether it's an inclusive education program they're funding or something from the global health sector, that it is an inclusive program and that the needs of the participants are being accommodated. That's very important. The other thing I would add to the gentleman in the back, there is a reporting requirement in this bill, and for me and our organization, transparency is so important so that we can hold the State Department accountable for the implementation of this bill. So I hope that answered your question.
Great. Leo, do you want the last word?
Yeah. What I like about this bill is that it focuses on building voice for the parents and communities, as well as agency and them being able to participate in decision making. As much as we like to advocate for children with disability internationally, I think our reach is limited. But if we're able to work with these parents and communities for them to be able to advocate, and they are the best advocates for their children, they will create the change that their children need, especially in education. It's difficult to build an inclusive education system. We have here in the US, but it's still full of gaps, and it requires a lot of money. But parents can support the education system, can support activities in the classroom. Communities can support education outside the school system as well. So I think in our education program, we need to think beyond the classroom and think about what else can be done within the community and with parents to bring inclusive education. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for joining us today. Thanks again to Senator Menendez's staff and for the support of Senator Moran and the 12 co-sponsors. The real hard work lies ahead. So we look forward to working closely with you. Please be in touch. We will be calling you to make sure we all roll up our sleeves and work together to demonstrate that this bill has a broad and deep and passionate constituency. The lives of millions of children with disabilities are at stake here. We cannot let a world continue where the lives of children with disabilities are expendable, where they can be put away and forgotten. We know it doesn't have to happen. The panelists have spoken so powerfully about what happens when we give children with disabilities an opportunity. We know it can be very different. Thank you all for your support. We look forward to working with you. Enjoy the reception in the back.